and thank you for the invitation today to join you to talk about my recent experiences in the Falkland Islands. Just so you know, the Minister of Foreign Affairs had asked me to join an international election observer team to observe the referendum that was being held on the future status of the Falkland Islands. The Governing Council of the Falkland Islands had decided to hold a referendum, part of its convincing of the UN and the world that the Falklanders wished to remain British in the face of a locally very unpopular but persistent Argentinian claim to the ownership of the islands. I find people are fascinated by the Falklands. There are more international media representatives present for the announcement of the result of the referendum than I've seen for New Zealand in New Zealand our general elections. The whole world was there to see them in this very remote place. Up here I've got a map of the Falkland Islands. They're bigger than most people expect. In total they're 12,173 kilometres. For comparison in area, the islands are over half the size of Wales, or about 7 times the size of Stewart Island. The two principal islands are the West Falkland and East Falkland, the two big islands, but in addition there are 776 small islands, many uninhabited, or I should say they have no people, but are crowded with sea life and penguins. You see many penguins in the Falkland Islands. The landscape is naturally very barren and very windy. It's absolutely treeless. There are no indigenous trees in the Falkland Islands. Short scrub-like bushes are the highest thing you will see. And unlike almost every other country colonised in the 1880s, the Falklands were completely without any human population prior to the arrival of settlers from England in the early 1800s. The land has a cold, windswept, consistently barren, big country feel about it. It reminded me of travelling along on the desert road. It does have some unusual features. There are several of these what are called stone runs, which are rivers of boulders that have been formed in the past. They're especially proud of them. They love taking people to look at the stone runs. They are amazing. This is the Falklands flag. Notice the sheep. There's a very close link in these islands between their traditional sheep farming industry and everything that they think and talk about. They have a tiny population. There are just under 3,000 native Falklanders, all very proud of their traditional way of life. The population is more varied than I expected. In the 2012 census, 59% of the residents describe themselves as a Falkland Islander, 29% consider themselves British, 10% St Helena. St Helena is a small British island further up in the Atlantic, which has very little economy, so they come to Falklands for the economy, and 6% consider themselves Chilean. Many people there speak Spanish. The way locals describe a Falkland Islander, it does not surprise me that only 59% of residents even consider they meet that test. One comment I heard really made the point. Before the referendum, we asked an older guy in Goose Green how he thought the referendum was going. He said, "Don't ask me. I've only been here for 59 years. Ask a local." The irony of the Falkland Islands is that although there was no indigenous population when the colonists arrived, there was no need for a treaty like the Treaty of Waitangi with its subsequent disputes that we all know about. They've had a greater dispute in the Falkland Islands over the ownership than we've had here in New Zealand, including the major war in 1982. The Falklands really does have a complex and tangled history. The islands have been argued over by Britain and Argentina for years, culminating in the 1980 war that cost 255 British lives, and who knows how many, but most reckon about 1,000 Argentinian lives. The Argentinian government refused to repatriate the bodies of their soldiers killed in the war to Argentina. They argued because the Falkland Islands are not the Falkland Islands, but rather the Islas Malvinas. They are part of Argentina, so their bodies are already buried in Argentinian soil. This dispute goes back a long way. Controversy still exists as to who was the first to discover the Falkland Islands, with competing Portuguese, Spanish and British claims dating back to the 16th century. The first reliable sighting is usually attributed to a Dutch explorer, Sebald van de Wit, in 1600, who named the archipelago the Sebald Islands, a name they bore on Dutch maps until the 19th century. In 1690, the British mariner Captain John Strong of the HMS Welfare when heading for South America, was driven off course and reached the Falkland Islands instead. Sailing between the two principal islands, what you remember from that map, he called the passage Falkland Channel. It's now called Falkland Sound, after Viscount Falkland, then Commissioner of the Admiralty and the financier of the expedition, and that is where the English name comes from. In 1764, the French navigator and military commander Louis Antoine de Bougainville founded the first settlement on Berkeley Sound in present-day Port Louis in East Falkland. A year later, in 1765, the British captain John Bryan explored, claimed and established a settlement on Saunders Island in West Falkland, where he named the harbour point Port Egmont. Unaware of the French presence on the other island, Bryan claimed the whole of the islands for the King George III. Spain became involved when it acquired the French colony in 1767 as part of a larger French-Spanish agreement. In 1770, the Spain attacked Port Edmund and expelled the British presence, bringing the two countries to the brink of war, which was avoided by the consequent peace treaty that gave Spanish permission for the British to return to Port Egmont. In 1774, economic pressures leading up to the American Revolutionary War forced Great Britain to withdraw from many of its overseas settlements, including their settlement in the Falklands. But upon withdrawal, the British left behind a plaque asserting their continued claim to the islands. Spain maintained its governor of the Falklands until 1806, when the Spanish governor left. As he departed, he left behind a plaque claiming the no islands in the name of the Spanish crown. Remaining Spanish settlers were actually withdrawn in 1811. The first successful permanent settlement was established by Louis Verneau in 1828. He took the Bob each way approach of getting permission to establish a settlement from both the British and the Spanish and Argentinian side. They soon introduced commercial cattle, with Spanish gaucho labour being introduced to manage those livestock. The next major nation to become involved in the Falkland Islands was the United States of America. A dispute over fishing and hunting rights resulted in a raid by the US warship Lexington in 1831. The log of the Lexington reports only the destruction of the arms and the powder store, but Verneau made a claim for compensation on the US government, claiming that his settlement was completely destroyed. Limited compensation was finally agreed by the US administration of President Cleveland in 1885, many years later. In 1831, when the US Lexington raided the Falklands, the captain declared the islands, quote, free from all government, end quotes. The 7 most senior members of the existing settlement were arrested for piracy and taken to Montevideo, where they were subsequently released without charge. In November 1832, Argentina sent Captain Mesfina as an interim commander to found a penal settlement, but he was killed subsequently in a mutiny. The project struggled, and the following January, British forces returned and requested the remaining Argentinian garrison to leave. Don Pinedo, the senior officer present, senior Argentine officer present, protested, but ultimately complied and departed. Verneau's settlement meantime continued until August 1833, when the leaders were killed in the so-called gaucho murders, committed by that group of gauchos that had been brought to manage the cattle during the earlier days of the settlement. The rebel gauchos were led by one Antonio Rivera. Rivera had been taken to the Falkland Islands by Verneau at the age of 20. Verneau had been a hard taskmaster, and the conditions of employment caused discontent amongst the workers. The workers were paid with promissory notes, which were devalued. They had all sorts of complaints. And on August the 26th, 1833, 8 months after the British returned to the Falkland Islands, the young Rivera led an attack against the senior members of the Verneau settlement, and a number were killed. The remaining population of Port Louis at the time, mainly women and children, fled to nearby Pete Island, where they were rescued by the sealer Hopeful in October of 1833, and then passed the information about the murders to the British authorities in Rio de Janeiro. In January 1834, the British ship HMS Challenger arrived, bringing Lieutenant Henry Smith, who set out to capture the murderers, by then hiding in the interior. The rebels or murderers, and depending on which side you are, they're rebels or murderers, were eventually caught and sent for trial in London, but under the British legal system could not be tried because the Crown Court did not have jurisdiction over the Falkland Islands at the time, of the alleged offences. British local government and local judiciary had not been installed in 1834. These came in 1841 by the formal issue of the letters patent. Because the rebel gaucho leader Rivera was from Argentina, and because he led a rebellion against the nascent British settlement as it was then, Rivera has acquired the status of a folk hero in Argentina, where he is portrayed as leading the first rebellion against British rule. Ironically, it was his actions that were responsible for the ultimate demise of the Verno enterprise on the Falklands. The settlers and leaders were gathered up and deported to Rio de Janeiro. From 1834, the islands were governed as a British naval station to 1840, when the British government decided to establish a permanent colony. It's been British in every sense since then, apart from the brief spell of Argentinian military occupation in 1982. But for that entire period, the dispute between Argentina, which calls them the Islas Malvinas, and the British, which calls them the Falkland Islands, has simmered away, periodically heating up as it did in 1982. Unquestionably, the people who live there now are overwhelmingly from British stock and strongly support the British connection, although to Argentina they are illegal intruders. As I say, the history of the Falkland Islands is a very complicated story. The capital was shifted to Port Stanley in July 1845, and this is a picture of Port Stanley. The harbour was considered to have a deeper anchorage. The settlement soon grew as a deep-water port, specialising in ship repairs. Indeed, until the construction of the Panama Canal, Port Stanley was a major repair stop for boats travelling through the Straits of Magellan. The rough waters and intense storms around Cape Horn forced many ships to Stanley Harbour, and the ship repair industry helped drive a thriving island economy. Later it became a whaling and sealing base for the South Atlantic and Antarctic, and in World War I, a major battle, the Battle of the Falkland Islands, was fought, which was a British victory over the German Asiatic fleet, was fought just off the Falkland Islands. And during World War II, Stanley served as a Royal Navy station to the service of ships that fought in their 1939 Battle of the River Plate, a battle involving a New Zealand ship, the HMS Achilles, for those that know the history. I've got a few pictures to go through to show you Stanley. It's a quaint little town, old houses and very close community life. There's one road that goes along the harbour front, and if you see pictures of trees, that's the post office and the main hall. The vehicle, the Globe Tavern, the life on the Falkland Islands is a small community, revolves around public bars. That's really all there's no movie theatre or anything like that, so they all go out, they do an awful lot of socialising. The vehicle of choice is the Land Rover, and as you can see there's a lot of British flags around, and if you notice the trees that they do have there, they're all bent one way, and that's reflecting the wind. And it's quite a steep town, as you can see. It comes straight up from that harbour front. That gives you some typical pictures. Now this is a picture of the Falkland Islands, because in 1982 there was the Falkland Islands War. In essence, the ground war commenced with the landings at St. Carlos Waters, which, if I can make this forward, works there. The attack on Goose Green, which was here by 2 para, and then finally the drive across the Falkland Islands to Port Stanley, which is here. The Battle of Goose Green, and I've got a map here, just to give you an idea. St. Carlos Waters is where the British troops was landed was here, and they had to come down here and take Goose Green. The Atlanta conveyor, which was the ship that was carrying all the helicopters and transport equipment for the British task force, was sunk by an Exocet missile. So when 2 para arrived there, they had absolutely no way of moving except for the traditional way of walking, or yomping as they call it. I've got some pictures here to give you an idea of the kind of, that is Goose Green Farm, about 160,000 hectares, managed by a New Zealander, interestingly. But you can see that's the kind of terrain they had to move across. There's not a lot of cover. They had to go mostly at night, and it was in the winter and very wet and cold. This is actually where they came down from. They call these here the hills that they used as their first attack point, and they attacked across this plain against about 1,000 Argentinian troops that were located there. This is the hall in Goose Green, where the entire local population was rounded up and held for a month and a half by the Argentinian authorities in pretty disgusting conditions. There was no love lost between Argentinians and Falkland Islanders by the time the that was open. But that is a typical settlement. As you see, there's no trees, just a few houses and buildings. This is a memorial to Colonel H. Jones, who made his name at Goose Green, who, when they were really starting to get pinned down, led a small detachment and charged up a hill, ending up being shot. But the fact that the British displayed such heroic courage forced 1,000 Argentinian soldiers to surrender to about a group of about 80 British soldiers. The Para are very proud of their achievements at Goose Green. I thought I'd show you this because we went to Goose Green and have a look over the place, and this is the cafe. It's the only cafe in that part of Falkland Islands, so it's 2 hours drive to the nearest place we can buy any food. And on the day we got there, the notice on the window, due to no heating, we're closed. So that's pretty typical of the area. The next thing to talk about is the drive, or the yont to Stanley. The rest of the Marines and the two Para had to march across here, all the way across the islands to Stanley, all the time subjected to air attacks and a bit of artillery. In fact, the British finally got themselves up into this area here, which are the mountains. Mount Tumbledown is the main one overlooking Port Stanley. Once they got their artillery up there, the Argentinians chose to surrender. And that is the Mount Tumbledown. I have to say, I really felt a lot of emotional connection. The number of people, 255 lives were lost in this battle for the Falkland Islands. And the people from England write notes, and the Falkland Islanders really, really deeply care for them. They regard these people as the ones that saved their country, and there's more emotion around it than you get around a lot of those sorts of ceremonies. As I say, that's Mount Tumbledown. That was the final position that they captured, and this is Port Stanley here. And fortunately, the Argentinians decided at that point in time to surrender rather than to persist. And here is the Liberation Monument, which the Falkland Islanders people have erected for those that have seen it. Everywhere you go in the Falkland Islands, you see debris of war. I thought I'd show you some pictures so you can see them. Crashed helicopters, Argentinian gun placements. You can see actually, if you look carefully, there's a boot there, still there. There's so much land in the Falkland Islands, so few people, that they don't really sort of go around and clean things up after them like we do. Bomb craters, that's what the cause of that is here. But that's typical of the sort of land that they were trying to cover and attack under. Mobile military kitchens, that's one up on Mount Tumbledown. And I'm showing that picture there because if you can just see that little sign there, that's minefield. Falkland Islands is covered in minefields. They laid an awful lot of mines, and they're all fenced off, and now the British government has signed an agreement that it will remove all the mines, and they're working hard on doing that now. It's interesting to note that Britain doesn't intend to be caught short again after what was really a surprise attack in 1982. They built a base at a place called Mount Pleasant, which is about an hour from Stanley, which is a very big base, cost £2.5 billion to construct, and they now maintain a very strong military force there. Well, that's one other part. That's a remaining part of an Argentinian Mirage aircraft there, and that is Mount Tumbledown again. Bomb fragments, and that's the propeller from the Atlantic conveyor, the ship that got lost that had all the helicopters that they were going to transport for. My purpose for being in the Falkland Islands was to observe the referendum as part of the International Observer Team. Unquestionably, the inhabitants of the islands prefer to remain British. Only 3 votes in the referendum, 3 votes in total, said no to continued British sovereignty. That was 99.8% vote in favour, which you'd have to say on any kind of vote is pretty convincing. And while the locals were very pleased with the outcome, they know it will not make any difference to the Argentinian claim. And what is the future of the Falkland Islands? Farming in the Falkland Islands is very tough. This is typical of the farms. Sheep farming is the major industry. They live a remote and self-sufficient life. Their emphasis is on high-quality wool exports. And this is typical of going around that. This guy took us around the farms. There's no bridges or anything. You just drive through the streams. And this is peat. There's an awful lot of peat there, and the houses generally are kept warm with peat. Tourism is the big industry now. People come to see penguins. They are pretty bloody amazing. If you look carefully, you can see the young fledglings there, dark brown looking fledglings. And of course there are an awful lot of penguins in the Falkland Islands. They are a beautiful bird, amazing to look at. Getting tough there to see these things is tough too. If you notice, these vehicles are all covered in mud and like that. That's transport on the Falkland Islands. They're not roads to the places where you go to see the Falklands. But by far the biggest industry now in the Falklands is the oil and fishing industry. This is the Falkland Economic Zone. Oil exploration and fishing, both licensed by the Falkland Islands government, remains controversial as a result of the maritime dispute with Argentina. But Britain keeps that area clear and is pressing on with oil exploration regardless. And they are a very wealthy little nation now. Those 3,000, they have $200 million of reserve, £1 million of reserves held in London for this population of 300. One thing that sets a small country and small population apart is how interconnected everyone is. Nothing in the Falkland Islands is private. Under the old radio system, I was telling John Nuxton, who actually has quite a lot of family in the Falkland Islands as a team now, that went on the way here, that they used to have a 10 o'clock in the morning when you could ring up the doctor from, and it was all, of course, on party lines. So if someone was ringing up to tell the doctor they had a problem with this, they had period problems or something like that, everyone on the island said, well, so-and-so's got this. They all know about everything. The second thing I thought was interesting about a quirky little country was the prisoners. There were 4 prisoners in the Falkland Islands, and they were held in the prison and the police station. One, their attitude to penalties was interesting because the penalties really reflects the understanding. There were 2 people in jail that they told me about that one of them we were able to go and collect a vote from. One was a guy who had always been a problem. He had done some fraudulent activities. He had been involved in a bit of robbery, but he was, the way it was explained to me, he was a grade A shyster, a really bad guy. And they basically put him in jail and thrown away the key. The other was a woman who had a marriage breakup and got very depressed and had stolen about the same amount of money. But they were letting her out in 4 years because she's not really a bad person. In other words, they're making a judgment about them, which was interesting. The final thing was the polling clerks. When I did my observing on West Falkland, the polling clerks were first cousins. And when I went the next day to Point Howard to look at the observing, the polling clerk was their mother and their aunt. It's very closely, a very close little country, as you would expect. I thought it should finish with some quirky notes. They do like to have bright coloured gardens. This is, you see quite a few gardens like this. That caught my fancy too as I floated the island that looked like a kiwi. And it really does if you look at it. This is an unusual road stopper, but not an unusual road stopper when you're in the Falkland Islands, a penguin. And visitors to the polling booth where we were doing our observing, these are the polling clerks here, and a cat sitting in the foreground looking at, or sheep that came to visit us in the polling booth. You don't see them. Finally, the local newspaper is called the Peckford News, which I thought was a fairly interesting name for a newspaper. And the final thing was an ad that I saw for one of the bars there, the Victory Bar. Husband Creech. Did he get under your nerves and under your feet? Why not leave him here? You get chocolate, free Creech, just pay for his drinks and we'll look after him. Thank you very much.